you certainly had to fight reflexively because you developed those reflexes, but you also have to be thinking your way through fights. And if you're not thinking your way through fights, you're going to get out, strategized by somebody who is.
Hello, friends. Thank you for tuning into this week's episode of the Mayn Idea Podcast, where today I have the pleasure of sitting down with Joel Jamieson. If you want to see this podcast grow in 2024 and continue to hear from more incredible guests, please take 30 seconds and leave a 5-star review on Apple or Spotify and subscribe to the YouTube channel. This helps the show tremendously with organic growth and show placement. The other way that you can support this show is by simply sharing it with someone who is passionate about Jiu Jitsu, strength and conditioning, and human performance. Joel Jamieson is a celebrated strength and conditioning coach to some of MMA's greatest athletes, an author and founder of 2 incredible training tools, 8 Weeks Out and Morpheus. For those of you who submitted questions on Reddit, please stick around towards the end of the episode as we dedicated a specific portion of this to answer those individually. To support the show, check out the sponsors in the show notes. And ladies and gentlemen, without further ado, Coach Joel Jamieson. Joel, thank you so much for taking the time to meet me on the podcast here. I've spent many hours in webinars listening to things you had to say when I was a coach at Equinox, and your book, Strength and Conditioning for Mixed Martial Arts, had a big impact on my career as a trainer. So to be face-to-face, it really means a lot.
No problem. Appreciate you having me. I wrote that book a long time ago, and it's always good to hear people that wrote it and applied it and used it and enjoyed it. So it's great to be on here.
Well, Scott, Rich Franklin on the cover, one of the GOATs. The guy was a school teacher, and he steps in the octagon. What a beast!
Rich is awesome.
I wanted to start with this book, so we'll actually start with the very, very beginning of the book itself, because you start with an interesting quote from Karl Gotch, Belgian wrestler, and you say, "Conditioning is the greatest hold." And I'm wondering, years later, this book came out, I believe, in 2009.
Yep.
Does that resonate with you still, and in what way?
Yeah, absolutely. Karl Gotch is a legendary wrestling coach, and he said that for a reason, right? It's simply that if you don't have conditioning, it doesn't matter how skilled you are, it doesn't matter how strong you are, it doesn't matter how mentally tough you are. If you don't have the gas, you're going to submit yourself because you aren't able to last until the end of the fight or end of the competition. And the more I've been in this field, the more I've seen over and over again, the athletes who are the most skilled, or like the most mentally tough, or the ones you think are always going to win, don't always win. And conditioning is often the reason for that, because again, you can be the most skilled in the world, but if you're too tired to use your skills, it doesn't do you any good whatsoever. So I think that's a great quote from an experienced coach, and it's still, I think it'll stand the test of time. I don't think that's ever going to change.
So you've been able to, from your perspective, all the knowledge that you have, and being able to watch something like the UFC grow in the time that it has from the early 2000s to now. What are your reflections as someone who understands conditioning to the degree that you do, as to how the sport's changed over that time period? As you go back to the early UFC days, it's kind of like a free-for-all of just who you are as you are. Are you a brawler or not? Can you beat the other guy? And now you're really starting to see like the true athleticizing of the sport. And you're seeing people come with really conditioned D1 backgrounds or former sport backgrounds and step into the sport and start to treat it like a professional sport, because it is now. So what have you seen change from a conditioning perspective? And what do you think that we need to be valuing as fans to respect the athletes, but also as athletes themselves, if they want to take this thing seriously and actually go anywhere with it?
Yeah, I think, as you mentioned, the biggest thing that I've seen is, and I started training my first athlete in like 03, 04, 20 years ago, you've seen this increase in athleticism across the board. And as you mentioned, kind of early days, it was like a wrestler versus a striker, or a striker, like a traditional striker versus a Muay Thai guy, right? You had these guys that were very specialized and they were very good in one area, and they used that to great effect, and they were able to win a lot of fights until they fought somebody who was a bad matchup for them, because they could neutralize their strength, and they couldn't do anything after that. So we've seen both just the well-roundedness of combat athletes improve, because now you can't really be only good at one thing. You have to be pretty good at everything. You might be really good at something, but you can't have a big glaring weakness and make it to the top of the game or stay there. And then you have to be a great athlete. I mean, I think, probably George St. Pierre was one of the first guys who was a really good high level athlete, and he just dominated for years because he was just more athletic than everybody. He was highly skilled, obviously, but he was such a great athlete. I think nowadays, if you would look across the UFC, you find plenty of guys that are in that caliber of athleticism and sometimes more. So the sports, as it's evolved, it's just become more well-rounded. And again, I would say Demetrious Johnson, who I worked with for a long time, in my mind, was probably the best in terms of athleticism and complete well-rounded skill. And that's why he was so great as he was and still is because he was able to put that package together. But I would just say, if you're going to be successful in the UFC or any other part of MMA combat sports, you have to have the total package to make it the top of the sport. And you didn't used to have it. The funny thing, Rich will tell you, the first thing is Rich will tell you he was never a great athlete. Like, he wasn't a great high school football player. Like, Rich was not the best athlete, and he'll freely admit that, but he was able to become a champion in the sport at a time where it wasn't quite the same level of athleticism that it is now. So if you're starting out, you better be a really good athlete. You better be well-rounded in your training and your preparation, your conditioning, your strength. You have to have a complete package if you want to get to the top and you want to build a career in the sport. And that's the way it should be. The longer sport's around, the more it should evolve and the higher level it should become. And I think we've seen that across the game.
Can you talk a little bit about the conversation with these athletes when you're in a sport that's so diverse, like mixed martial arts, or even you could say the same for grappling? So much of what you have to do is the sport itself. So if you want to be a dynamic striker or a good wrestler, you need to wrestle and you need to strike. And if you're in mixed martial arts, you have to bring those two things together and you have to get a lot of reps. If you're a grappler, if you want to compete in ADCC or IBJJF or anything, gi or no gi, you have to train a lot of jiu-jitsu to be technically savvy enough and have the isometric strength and the scrambling endurance and all these things to be proficient, actually give people a run for their money. So what's the coaching conversation like when you get an athlete and you're like, hey, your low-hanging fruit is this, your conditioning is not that great, we really need to ramp that up, but you're juggling all these different balls, plus you throw in the personality of a mixed martial artist. How do you rope them in, and how do you start to paint this picture of what it looks like to rope or like build conditioning in, and then the timelines of that? Because it takes time to build conditioning. This isn't a 5-minute abs kind of thing. So how do you communicate that to them, and how do you choose what to focus on if you have a 16-week camp or an 8-week camp or something like that?
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that's what you just talked about is the biggest challenge of the sport, right? Because most traditional pro sports, at least, internationally, have some sort of an off season. They have a period of time where the sport's not being trained at a high level, and that just isn't the case with combat sports. So first of all, you can't treat it like another sport where there's an off season, because there isn't. So you have to have a different mindset when you approach it of, okay, I can't train this athlete 4 or 5 days a week as I might if it was, a soccer player or American football player or whatever. You can't do that because they're not going to be successful if you do it. So you just have to be aware of that from the very start. And I think secondly, you treat each person like an individual. So this isn't the same conversation with each person. It's not the same approach with each person. It really depends on the individual athletes that you're dealing with and what he or she needs to improve the most. And I always start with that. If I can drill down to what is the most limiting area for that individual, then I can figure out, okay, how do I improve that limiting area? And I'm talking about people that are high up. The people that are at the bottom, they have everything to improve. It becomes much easier to do it with lower volumes and lower intensities because they just need the training. But somebody, a high level pro or, a high level world champion, all these guys and girls, you want to find their weakest link. Like, what is it about their physical athleticism or their actual striking, grappling, wrestling, whatever? What are the areas that are the worst? What is holding them back? And then you have to just be able to target that specific area rather than trying to say, okay, I'm going to improve everything at once. So even conditioning, that's a broad term, right? Maybe someone's conditioning striking is great because that's what they do a lot. Maybe in the ground, they gas out for various reasons or vice versa. And they can have very specific positions that they have trouble with, or they just have good conditioning, but they have good fitness, but they can't control the energy very well. And they're too amped up and they're too adrenaline spiked, and they can't relax enough when they're competing. That's a conditioning problem in and of itself, even though it's different than somebody who just doesn't have the physical capacity. So you really just have to treat each person as the individual that they are. do the assessment, figure out what they're doing, figure out where you think they can improve the most. And then you have to figure out where that fits within their training plan, like you mentioned. So, the first thing I do is I have somebody write out, what are your trainings? What does your training schedule look like? How many days per week are you training? How many hours are you training? On a scale of 1 to 10, how hard is each one of those training sessions? If I can get them to wear a heart rate monitor so I can actually see the volume and intensity of their training sessions, that's an even bigger bonus. But I take a step back and I look at the big picture of what they're currently doing and then figure out what is there actually room for. What can we add in here, or what do we have to subtract from what you're doing to make this achievable? Because you can't just take 8-10 hours a week of skill training and then add another 4 hours a week of strength conditioning and think something's not going to break. So, and I think that's unfortunately what a lot of people do. You just have to recognize that programming as a whole, it's not like two individual separate things that are unrelated. Your skill work, your strength conditioning work, your recovery, your treatment, all those things are just part of one program, and you can't treat them as these very separate, unrelated things. So again, this is the challenge, and this is why combat sports are difficult, and this is where I still think we need the most room for improvement, or have the most room for improvement, because a lot of athletes go to different coaches at different gyms still these days, and they don't always have great communication between those coaches and those gyms, and there's not the cohesiveness that there needs to be.
It's so unforgiving too that on top of all that, they could listen to you like a newborn, and then they go in there and you just get kneed in the like Gilbert Burns, extremely conditioned, puts so much effort into his training. It's incredible to watch, and he's such a phenomenal fighter and person outside of the ring. And then he goes in there and Jack just wha-bam, right? And there it goes, and that's all the months of training and all the weeks, and then it's just can be a dice roll.
It's the worst.
It's crazy.
It's the worst. It's the worst. I've been in multiple corners of fights where either world championship or high level, and like I said, it's one mistake, or just one thing goes wrong, or the other guys just one thing right at the right time, and like you said, all that work down the drain in terms of the result. But hopefully the athlete learns from the experience and gains some skill and some development from just going through the process, and you come back the next time and hope for a different outcome. But yeah, it's horribly frustrating. It'd be like if you were, and especially when you're completely dominating a fight, that's the worst, right? I've had fights where someone's just dominating for 3 to 5 rounds, and then the last 30 seconds, 60 seconds, something goes wrong. I mean, that is the most painful. But it's also part of what makes the sport fun and challenging, and why we watch it. It's unpredictable.
Totally. Can you elaborate a little bit on two things? One is hormone or adrenaline. Sorry. So how adrenaline and kind of hormone cascades affect things like conditioning. I mean, the walkout's a great example, right? These fighters sit in the back, they warm up to some degree. Maybe they wait 10 minutes, maybe they wait 35 minutes. This happens to competitors on IBJJF or even local regional stuff. You go, you weigh in, they put you in the corral, and then I've had a tournament where it was 45 minutes later. So maybe you can talk first on what does adrenaline do to your conditioning on that day when you arrive, when you've done all the preparation and everything, and now you're here, you're in the tournament, you're in the competition, you're about to walk into the octagon, what adrenaline does. And then secondly, I'd like to talk about what body shots do to your level of conditioning and why that has such an acute effect. And they say in boxing and in striking, invest in the body early. Is that just a thing that announcers say, or is there a physiological effect that's happening to our bodies when we're receiving those shots that begin to take away from that gas tank? So however you want to unpack those two things.
Yeah, I mean, sure. First is adrenaline, right? Adrenaline is this hormone that drives up our ability to produce more force, more power. It increases awareness. It does a lot of things. It's part of basically what we call the stress response. And it's the stress response for a reason, because we have to be able to respond to some sort of external stressor. And at the highest levels, our adrenaline and other hormones like noradrenaline and cortisol and all these things are just surging through our bodies because we know we have to produce all this force and power, and we're going to be in front of people and we could get knocked out. There's just this huge rush. So on the one hand, it potentiates performance, where it makes us capable of higher levels of force and power than we would be able to generate if we didn't have it. On the other hand, it's also going to increase the cost of doing anything, because we're producing so much force and power that it's easy to do. It's easy to essentially overproduce it to the point where it's costing us more energy to produce the same level of power output. And then you have this big dump in the backside, because evolutionarily speaking, like the fight or flight response is not meant to be held for 25 minutes. It's fight or flight. It's go catch the prey or don't be the prey yourself. And it's get out of dodge before you get eaten, or go eat something else. It wasn't meant to be 5-minute rounds of being chased or chasing someone around. So we don't have the capacity to sustain these very high heart rates, these very anaerobically driven periods and these very high levels of adrenaline for very long without the body having to start to pull back, because it's just it's so stressful in the body, and it creates an internal environment that is not conducive to continuing performance. So when you overproduce adrenaline, it just means you're producing more than you actually need. Like if I can produce, I'm just making numbers up here, like 500 watts of power without a huge amount of adrenaline, then I want to be able to do that. If I produce twice the amount of adrenaline necessary, it's just increasing the cost of doing everything, and that's going to increase my rate of slowing down. So it's a double-edged sword. You want the right amount and you need the right amount, but overproducing it just makes you more likely to slow down faster and gas out. So it's about control. It's about the ability of your body to control that, and that's where the mental side of the game really comes in. It's where being focused and relaxed and aware and having the skill set to not overproduce adrenaline and not gas yourself out with that becomes such a vital trait and such an important skill to develop. And it's something I think people don't develop intentionally enough. It's an area we can train intentionally in a lot of different ways, and it makes a big difference. So
to stick on that for a moment, sorry, real quick, to stick on that. So as a conditioning coach, I think a lot of people think, they just strap people up to a VO2 max assessment. They find out a couple of special numbers, they punch it in a computer, and then they just make these people run on, incline treadmills and then train their sport. This is a huge area of coaching to get these athletes to stay calm under pressure, right? To then capitalize on dump the adrenaline when you're in ground and pound, right? Or dump the adrenaline in the scramble in the last minute of your finals match versus the being in the corral waiting for your first match, right? So is that actually something that you talk about with your athletes? Like how to, yes, we're doing all this work, we're building this engine, this capacity and all this stuff, but you got to learn like where your gears are for this kind of thing too. Do you talk to them about that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, it's all trainable. These are all trainable traits, qualities. So there's two things to it. The first is, as you mentioned, you need to be aware of your gears, or however you want to use the terminology. You need to be aware of what your body is capable of, because there's a point where when you go above a certain power output, the price of that the cost of that is fatigue. And so you need to be aware of kind of where those lines are, and they need to be very, very clear of, if I'm going to go for this finish, or I'm going to keep pushing for this takedown, or I'm going to whatever. If they don't get it, there's a price to pay for that. No matter what your fitness level is, you're still going to cause yourself some fatigue. If you go for something and you're just cranking on something and you don't get it, there's a price for that. And you need to be aware of that in the moment, and make an informed decision. Should I go for this, or should I back off because I'm not going to get it? And that's part of just building an intelligence in the athlete and building experience. And that's a huge part of coaching. Don't go for something if you're not going to get it, because you're going to potentially gas yourself out and get knocked out right afterwards. We've seen this happen dozens of times. So this should be both the skill coaches reinforcing this and developing that fight IQ, but also as a strength and conditioning coach, I'm having heart rate monitors on my athletes. I'm building that awareness through their cardiovascular training, through their conditioning. They see what their heart rates are at. They start to become much more aware of, oh, hey, when I hit my 160s, like I can't sustain much more than this before I start to slow down. So they need to know what that feels like. They need to build that awareness and training so that they're consciously aware of it in the fight. And again, you certainly had to fight reflexively because you develop those reflexes, but you also have to be thinking your way through fights. And if you're not thinking your way through fights, you're going to get out, strategized by somebody who is. And then the second thing is, part of this adrenaline is just the body is not very calm when it's dealing with unfamiliar situations. And the first fight, you're going to be loaded up with nerves, and you've got all this adrenaline pouring through your system. By your 50th fight as a pro, a lot of that's gone, or at least it should be. It's not nearly the same as it was. So just doing things like getting yourself into the octagon or the arena that you're going to be competing in as part of your training at the same time of day, having the same food, just having the fewest things being unfamiliar on fight night, and having warm-up routines and walkout routines and going through those routines, all the familiarity you can bring into a fight, the more the athlete's going to feel comfortable, and the less they're likely to, have an adrenaline dump or just way overthink it and talk themselves into bad situations. So there's a lot of things you can do. This is a huge part of the game, because it's such a big piece of winning is being calm and cool and collected and being able to think your way through fights. And if you, again, I hate to use DJ for every example, but I think it's one of the best things DJ did is DJ would come back in the middle of the rounds or after a round, and he would like sit there and talk to Matt about exactly what he saw, and what he saw was the openings and what he felt and what he wanted to do. And then Matt would have his great verbal interactions, and DJ would just go back out and execute. And you could just tell that throughout the entire round, DJ was thinking his way through things, what was happening. He was analyzing an opponent. He was analyzing what he was doing. He was aware of everything. And that was part of what made him such a special, is what part makes him such a special athlete. And I was there in the corner to see that. And it's just a really great example of, an athlete who's at the top of their game, at the top of the sport, able to recognize and be aware of everything that's happening, not just reacting, but thinking its way through the entire fight. And that's the level you need to get to if you really want to get the top.
That's a different kind of, I think people can take fighters for boneheads because it has a barbaric element to it. And you need to be an aggressive person. You have to believe that you can win if you're going to be in that sport, period.
Yep,
but it's really impressive when you see the IQ level of some of these people in the moment. GSP, a great example. Izzy, Demetrious, when they're in there, you can see it on their face. They're solving math problems while someone's trying to truly hurt them. And they go back and they have that awareness that they're seeing it as it's happening. It's something really special. And it delineates between someone like that and someone who they get on that main card for the first time with 5 rounds and they had to wait longer to get out in the ring. And then there's more music and there's more crowd and there's more noise, and you see it affect them because it's new elements that they're not used to. And that difference in caliber it's really impressive. What about the body shots?
Yeah, look, I think getting hit in the body or the head or anywhere else has a pretty big physiological impact. And when you hit to the body, there are definitely some reflexive mechanisms that tell the brain, I don't like this, shut down, or at least reduce power output or avoidance. So, I don't know if I've seen a ton of research on the exact physiological. I don't think we really understand exactly what's happening, but clearly when you get hit in the body, it's a different reaction than you get kicked in the leg, right? There's something happening there that's causing the body to want to shut down in some capacity, or at least drastically reduce power output and kind of get out of the situation. So, look, there's certainly some conditioning you can do, some training you can do that helps mitigate that. But the best training is to not get hit there in the first place and to avoid it. But right. there's something going on there, but I don't know we can say exactly what it is.
So when you started coaching athletes and you've mentioned heart rate a couple of times, that's something that you utilize to measure the intensity of the session that they're in, and then also to teach them that awareness of, hey, when your heart rate's around this area, this is your go mode. This is when you need to kind of back it off to save yourself for the effectiveness of each of the coming rounds. You also developed Morpheus. What was it about deciding to create that product in a market where there's already tons of heart rate monitors, right? Like Polar has heart rate monitors, Garmin makes heart rate monitors, Apple's putting them in watches. It's so abundant. What made you say, hey, if we're going to do this, we got to do this right, and this is how it needs to be done if we actually care about utilizing this kind of data to make decisions with people?
Sure. I mean, the main thing is, I think, even though, as you mentioned, there's I don't know, dozens or hundreds of heart rate monitors and apps out there, most of them, actually, I'd say probably all of them, work on this idea that your heart rates are always the same in terms of what that represents to you. So 90% of your heart rate is always 90% of your heart rate, your zone 5 or whatever, 80%, 90% is always the same. But the reality is, just like, 80% of your max on a squat might feel pretty light one day and heavy the next day. It's the same thing with heart rates. So I wanted to connect heart rates and heart rate training to somebody's recovery and their HRV and make that connection, because heart rate training needs to be considered individualized, just like any other aspect of training. So what Morpheus does is it looks at your HRV, it looks at your recovery, it looks at your previous workouts, and it's going to adjust your heart rate zones based on those factors. So we're really trying to just quantify intensity with heart rates, right? That's what heart rates are doing. Higher heart rates, higher percentage of max rate. Max heart rate is a higher intensity. We want to be able to use that to train more intelligently. But again, 90% of your max heart rate is going to feel very differently depending on your level of fatigue, depending on what you did the last couple of days. It's not always the exact same amount of intensity. So Morpheus is really the first system out there that solves that problem. It creates personalized heart rate zones every single day based on your recovery that are different and adjusted to you. And then it has the training methods that I used over the years to train different athletes built into the app. So if you want to do a particular type of cardiovascular work, conditioning, there are methods in there that it just guides you through. And so I just wanted to make it something that was more active than just put on a heart rate monitor and record your workout. We do a lot more than that. We show you how the workout impacts your recovery. We have those heart rate zones very personalized. So I think it's a much better tool to really build conditioning than just most heart rate monitors you just kind of throw on and you see, oh, my average is 145 and I train for 45 minutes. Like that doesn't really
Right.
make me training any differently. It's not really valuable in the grand scheme of things. And so that's why I create Morpheus.
What could you explain a little bit how HRV affects someone's ability to perform, or why you want more heart rate variability as an athlete or as someone who's pursuing grappling sports, jiu-jitsu, mixed martial arts?
Yeah. So, I mean, heart rate variability is a big topic, but there's two big pieces to be aware of. The first is your heart rate variability is a reflection of your body's autonomic nervous system, which is how your body is regulating itself internally. And there's two branches to that. There's one we've already kind of talked about, the fight or flight system. That's the sympathetic system, and that drives heart rate up and drives cortisol up and does all these things. And then the other is the parasympathetic system, which essentially works in tandem, but does the opposite thing. So it lowers heart rate, it lowers adrenaline, and it repairs and recovers and adapts, all those sorts of things. And these two systems need to work together based on what you're doing. So when you're training, you want to turn that sympathetic system on. That would decrease heart rate variability. When you're done with that, you want to turn the sympathetic system, the fight or flight system, down. And you want to turn on that recovery parasympathetic side of things. And that's what you want to happen. And so we see those changes over time in heart rate variability on a daily basis. So we see your body's daily changes based on what you're doing and what your body is responding to. So on a daily basis, high or low could be good or bad. It's more about where are you in relation to your normal baseline and how much variability is there. So if we see huge changes in your heart variability, it just means you're under a lot of stress. Your body's expending a lot of energy to recover from that stress and deal with that. And so we can take that into account. So we look at on a daily basis, we don't look at the direction as much as we just look at like where are you in relation to normal and how much stability or instability has there been in your numbers in the last few days. And that helps us make decisions. Now, the second piece of this is your average HRV very much lines up with your cardiovascular fitness and your VO2 max as a whole. There are a lot of genetic factors as well, but on average, high level athletes going to have a much higher VO2 and a higher HRV than somebody who's much lower level of fitness. So we can look at the trends over time to see if that person's fitness is improving and their cardiovascular fitness is improving without having to go to VO2 max tests all the time. It'll at least tell us if things are trending the right direction in general. So on a daily basis, we just use it to help make decisions. If I see someone's HRV is all over the place and it's been all over the place the last 2 or 3 days, I might be aware that maybe we want to dial things back a bit this workout, or maybe we want to do some additional recovery work, or maybe we want to talk about what's been going on in their sleep or their diet or whatever else might be playing a role in that. If I see the things that we want to see to be able to go 100%, then great, we go 100%. So it's just a management tool. It's a way to manage the daily process and make sure that they're going the right direction. And then again, too, we can see if they're going the right direction by whether or not their numbers are improving. So it's a very valuable tool as long as you, use it consistently, measure it the right way, and use that data to make training more individualized to you.
Yeah, I went to Utah for a ski trip this year, and my HRV, I was sick when I went there and then went up to altitude, and it was all over the place. And I had
Yep.
never been sick and monitored that at the same time, and then also had data to compare it to from previous months, like previous consecutive months. And I was really surprised. And then very much with my recovery from the sickness, as I got back, everything began to stabilize again. And I was like, wow, this is something a lot of people talk about, but I don't know if they actually know how to integrate the data into like making changes in their life. And I get asked a lot about it at training because people will wear, either they wear a soft whoop covering or a Morpheus strap or something while they're training jujitsu, and they have all this information, but that they're confused about, what do I actually do with it? How do I make decisions about this? So I know that within Morpheus that's baked in, right? But let's say someone is kind of earlier on in their getting their feet wet with this, like, how do I actually make decisions in my life based on these kind of information? What's a good place for them to start?
Sure. I mean, the biggest thing to understand is that it's not just one variable that's driving this. I think people make this assumption that, oh, it's just a workout, like that's all that is driving this. No, it's your entire lifestyle that's driving HRV. So it's sleep, it's diet, it's mental
Right.
stress, it's training, it's your temperature, it's all of these things rolled into one number, and that's what makes it somewhat tricky. But the easiest thing to do, like I just mentioned, is if you see periods where it's jumping all over the place, then you're under a lot of stress, and putting yourself under even more stress is probably not going to speed up that process of getting back to normal. So And if you don't want to pay any attention to directionality or trends, literally just kind of look at that. Like, how far am I away from my normal numbers? And if you're pretty far away, you're probably doing too much. You need to back off a little bit. If you're kind of staying in a normal range, then you're probably doing a good job and you can keep doing what you're doing. It's stability really that you are looking for in a lot of ways. So I think the first thing people can do is just use that to gauge and see and become more aware of how different types of things affect them. People, generally speaking, don't realize how much sleep affects them until they see HRV. They don't realize how much alcohol affects them until they see HRV. They don't realize how much mental stress affects them until they see HRV. So I think kind of this big first picture is just building awareness of how these different factors, your lifestyle, affect your HRV. And once you have that awareness, then you can start to make smarter decisions about what you're doing. Maybe you realize, hey, I really should get a little bit more sleep tonight, or maybe I shouldn't go have a few more beers after I train, or whatever, because you start to realize how much those things impact you. And that, again, that starts with recognizing that HRV is not just the workout. If you think it's only the workout, then you're totally missing all these other variables in your lifestyle that are also playing a huge role. So I like to use it, like I said, I think as a first place is just awareness. Like, pay attention to what you're doing on a daily basis and look at what your HRV does. And you'll start to see these patterns emerge, and you'll start to recognize the behaviors or things that you do that are probably not very beneficial for you. And hopefully you'll then make changes.
So I'll give you like a brief backstory on this, and I think what I'm really looking for is proof that what I'm doing makes sense. But I read this book by James Nestor called Deep that was about freedivers. Fascinated me. I thought it was phenomenal, and it pushed me to then read Breathe, his second book. That made me rethink everything about nasal breathing, mouth breathing, sports performance. And as a former competitive skier, that was never introduced to me. I skied for 12 years competitively. Not one day was ever spent talking about breathing. We did talk about like aerobic conditioning, anaerobic conditioning. Our sport was very short. It was 25 seconds, all out mogul skiing, and very high heart rates in that time period. Never talked about breathing. I read this book. I start running, breathing nasally, taping my mouth shut when I do Jiu Jitsu. Like, I mean, everything that I could do, I would shut my mouth while I did it. And I think I was kind of like reaching for some purpose behind it. And I'm hoping maybe you could shed some light on, is this snake oil, or is there something that's actually happening when you train under stress and force yourself to breathe out of your nose? What are the benefits of doing that? Why are we actually seeing mixed martial artists start to implement this in their training? It's also, from just experience, it's a telltale sign of someone who's calm in grappling arts, right? You roll with the black belt, they keep their mouth shut the whole time. It's kind of like, what's going on with this guy? They're going to tie me up in a knot. What's actually happening in our body when we do that?
Well, I think it's the big picture of it comes back to what we talked about earlier. It's forcing you to not turn on that sympathetic system more than you need to be, because part of how we activate that parasympathetic system is by a massive increase in respiratory rate, right? And you can obviously breathe more oxygen in and out through your mouth than you can through your nose. And so it's forcing you essentially to stay within a certain autonomic range or a certain level of adrenaline output, you could say. And it's very easy for people to overproduce it. Like I mentioned, it's very hard for people to stay more relaxed if they're hyperventilating, they're breathing very rapidly. So I think the biggest thing it does is it just trains you to do exactly what you just said and be more calm, be more relaxed in the situation, which means you're ultimately becoming more efficient in that situation. You're not overproducing adrenaline in those situations. And so I think there are probably some other physiological effects from the actual oxygenation piece of it. But I think the biggest thing is, like I said, it's forcing you to not overactivate that sympathetic system any more than it should be or needs to be given what you're doing. And it's probably developing just better overall respiratory patterns as well, which ties into movement and all sorts of other things. So I don't think it's snake oil at all. I think there are certainly benefits to it, and plenty of people are doing it and seeing improvement. So I'd say, again, it's kind of one of those things. If you're skeptical, you're not sure if it's going to help you, start incorporating your training and see if you notice anything different in your HRV. If you start seeing, some positive signs in there, then it's probably having an impact on what you're doing.
Would you say that there's any benefit to the exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, and nitrogen? Like, how are those working in our system through things like high effort exertion, like a wrestling exchange? Like, what's happening in our body with these gases, and how can training ourselves to regulate that through our nose, is that actually going to do something beyond what you just said, which is really this like taming of your your parasympathetic and your sympathetic nervous system.
I
But is there
mean, you're
some
not.
other benefit in
I mean,
how we
you're not.
regulate oxygen and carbon dioxide?
I mean, not necessarily to a high level. You're as you blow off carbon dioxide, that's part of, again, all of the respiratory things that happen are just part of the natural feedback loops of our body trying to figure out how much oxygen it needs and how much you should breathe and how much you should produce power. I mean, these are all just part of our natural feedback and regulatory mechanisms. And I think slowing that process down and forcing it to happen through our nose probably just causes some changes in some of those reflexes. And we start to become better at moving more and producing force with maybe a little bit less oxygen, and that has benefits for endurance. So you're not fundamentally changing the respiratory system. You're just changing the flow of oxygen and the transport of carbon dioxide through the body. So I don't think you're making any sort of like wholesale physiological changes that aren't possible with the mouth. You're just doing it at a much lower rate and in a way that probably slows everything down and makes it so you become more efficient. As I said, those are probably the main changes that we see. But a lot of this stuff is so context dependent. Like, it's going to be different depending on what you're doing. It's different for different people. There are a lot of individual variances here. It's easy to say, oh, it's always doing this. Maybe not. There's just so many differences, and depending on intensity, depending on volume, depending on the individual and their own respiratory capacity, depending on their nasal structure. I mean, there's so many things that go into this. It's hard to make generalizations because it's probably not always the same.
Well, I really appreciate the nuance, because I feel like, especially with the fact that people get a lot of information from social media, and it tends to be so dogmatic by way of garnering likes and interests. So people will choose a topic and say, the only way to do X, Y, or Z is this, or this is the only thing. And they won't back it up with any research. They won't back it up with science, and they won't ask people that know more about it than they do. And then that's what people kind of take and run with it, versus the actual truly complex nature of all this kind of stuff and how many different factors go into it when you're really assessing how to create greater outcomes for somebody. Are there any?
Yeah, have you heard of real quick? This is an important topic. Real quick, have you ever heard of the Dunning-Kruger effect? Because this is something people can be aware of. I mean, I think this is what we see in social media. So for those of you people aren't aware, Dunning-Kruger effect basically shows this human tendency where people have very low levels of expertise, often rate themselves as knowledgeable, expertise driven, or expertise level as people who are real experts in the field. So the less you know about something, the more confident you are, because often you don't understand the complexity. You don't know what you don't know. And so you're like, oh, I know this. This is the way that it is. But then somebody who's a true expert who studied for 20 years is like, I don't know. I mean, there's a lot of variables to it. It's not that simple. And the more you truly understand about a subject, the more complex you realize it is, the less dogmatic you generally are. And so I would just say it's something people be aware of. If you're following someone on social media and they have the answer to everything about everything, and they're 100% sure that this is the way it is all the time with everyone, they probably don't know what the hell they're talking about, because that's just not how the human body is. There's so much we don't know. There's so many differences from one person to another. There's so many assumptions that we've had that have been proven wrong. There's just endless room for individuality that we still don't understand. Like there's not this like, oh, this is how it is, case closed. That's not the case in most of how the human body works. So we have.
You can't just pour celery juice on it and fix everything. I thought that's the cure, right? Are there any things that stick out that are particularly frustrating to you, that are, given your knowledge as a coach in your position, having done this for so long, and to your point about this effect, like admitting that the more that you know, the less you actually know about everything. Are there anything in the world of conditioning or in mixed martial arts that are particularly frustrating to you, that you see circulating or you see moving around?
Yeah, I mean, I think the biggest thing for years that's finally kind of started to break, at least, was just high intensity all the time, Tabata, everything, always, forever.
Hit.
I mean, I think that kind of methodology of that mindset of like, oh, it's just always hit. You just do hit. That's it. Like, that was a very dogmatic way of thinking, and it was very unfortunate that it infested the sport and other sports, not just combat sports, but everything just became, how much could you just smash yourself into the ground? And that's probably one thing I would say about combat sports, is there's this very baked in idea of the harder something is, the better it is. And that's just not how it works either. Right. So it's just those sorts of mentality things I think are problematic. I think now we're seeing this huge, I don't want to open this can of worms, but we're seeing a really big emphasis now on like, I'm a woman, so I should train this way, and I'm a man, so I should train this way. And like, yeah, there are differences between men and women, obviously, and those differences need to be taken into account. But they're just part of all the differences between each individual. They're not like, oh, I'm a man, I train this way, I'm a woman, I train this way instantly, without all the other variables we need to understand. So I think we tend to categorize things and then make dogmatic statements about them. And again, kind of the more you appreciate the complexity, the more you realize those categories are probably just artificial in some sense, and obviously some sense are real, but they're not just like, oh, you're this person, so you do this, and you're that way, so you do that. Like there's just so much more nuance to training and to life than that. It's just such a vast oversimplification.
So actually touching on this exact thing. So I wanted to speak a little bit specifically about ADCC, the rule set, and how one should condition themselves in hopes of going to trials or then making it onto the finals and going to ADCC, as this is a huge, not emerging, it's been around for a while, but it's definitely garnering a lot of attention in the world of grappling. And I think because of, I don't mean to blame CrossFit. I just think it's the easiest example of where someone would end up participating in that mentality of like, if you're not grinding yourself to a literal halt and laying on the ground, like a chalk outline at the end of your workout, then you didn't do anything. And people will look at something like grappling and they go, grappling is hard. Wrestling exchanges are hard. Scrambles exhaust you. Then I guess I must train really intensely if I ever want to have a chance of being competitive in the sport or training well with my teammates. So to expand on like the rule set specifically. So if we go by kind of each of these phases, because I think it's important to break them down one by one. If you go to ADCC trials, it's a 6-minute bout. So that's 6-minute stand-up exchanges and then 3 minutes of overtime if you get to that. The first 3 minutes, there's no points scored. So you can win by submission, but you're not going to get points for passing guard. You're not going to get points for mount, and you're not going to get docked points.
Yeah. So look, the big thing to understand is that it's going to depend entirely on the context, the circumstances, because one, grappling coach might have a pretty good grasp of just building conditioning into the session, even if it's somewhat unintentionally, just by how they structure the program, the workouts, and the drilling and the rolling. And then another one might not. So you got to start with kind of, what am I getting in general? You got to kind of ask yourself this question: what am I getting from my sport specific training? What am I not getting? So what needs to be added outside of that? If the rolling is all very lower intensity and they're just drilling lower intensity, and you're not doing a whole lot of high intensity grappling, then maybe you need more high intensity work outside of that. If it's the opposite and they're killing you all day long and you're just constantly going high intensities, you're not getting as much of the lower intensity work you need, then you might need to add that in. Or if you feel like you're not getting the strength, or you're not getting the mobility, or you're not getting something else that you feel like you need in your game, then that's what you want to train outside of the sport. So you just, again, you kind of come back to, what am I missing? Like as an athlete, what am I not getting enough of? Right. And then we also have to consider this concept of general conditioning versus specific conditioning. General conditioning means it'll apply to any movement or any movement pattern. Specific conditioning is just that specific sport or that specific pattern. And mostly what you need in BJJ is just a lot of BJJ, as you mentioned. But it doesn't mean you don't need to ever lift weights, or you don't need to ever do any sort of things outside the gym. So I would say for the most part, 80 to 90% of your training time is going to be spent drilling your sport, because that's what you have to do. You cannot take time away from that. And then the other, difference there can be something outside of the gym. But when it comes to like an actual event like you're talking about, most of that comes down to structuring your actual training sessions around those particular periods. So easy example, when we were training prize fighters, they had a 10-minute round, a 90-second rest period, and a 5-minute round, and then a second 5-minute round in the case of a world title fight. So were we training them with 5-5s? No, because they weren't trained for 5-5s. They were trained for a 10-minute round with 90-second rest. And the pacing was totally different. And I think you actually saw a really good example when Pride guys came over to UFC initially, they struggled with the pacing because the pace of a 5-minute round was different than the pace of a 10-minute round. And the scoring was different. So, that's the specific element to conditioning. So if you're talking about, hey, I got to get ready for a specific competition, and here's the structure of that competition, that should be trained in your BJJ leading into the event for weeks on end. Your body should be getting very used to that pace, because that's what you're training. You're training pace and the body being used to that structure. So if it's this very specific system, the first 3 minutes, this is what we're doing. The second 3 minutes, this is what we're doing. that should be drilled and drilled and drilled as part of your training in the BJJ, not just outside the gym and strength conditioning stuff, but that should be the primary focus of your BJJ for weeks leading up to it. That's how you develop that awareness and that timing and that pacing, that rhythm, and how your body gets used to performing that level.
Yeah, I listened to you talk on Mark Bell's podcast about that specifically, about bringing guys from Pride over to the UFC and some of the tribulations that came about that. That it's
Yep.
kind of a perfect segue. And I think in a way you answered in that statement my next question, which is, so if we look at from, let's say someone qualifies in trials, like the West Coast trials that just happened here, and in August they want to go and they want to fight and, you know, get to the finals match in ADCC. Well, the finals match is 20 minutes plus a 10-minute overtime. So it has similar structure into that first 10. There's only negative points, so you can only get docked. And then in that second 10 minutes, you can get positive or negative points. Again, just changing the intensity of what is available to the athletes in the time period. But if we're looking at that, I mean, 20 minutes is a lot different grappling against a world-class competitor, because at that point, that's what it is, right? You're in the finals of ADCC, so you're only going to be meeting world-class people versus West Coast trials or Brazilian trials or East Coast trials where you're at a 6-minute round. So in my head, it doesn't make sense to every time you train jiu-jitsu only train 20-minute rounds either. So what is the kind of, what would someone's adjustments look like if they go, wow, amazing, I qualified in trials, this is phenomenal, I'll go to quarters, and then let's say they get through quarters, and now if in this time example it's April, May, June, July, August, they're there in 5 months. So what do you do as an athlete that's on that path to your training style?
Yeah, it's just shifting time spent in these different realms, right? And so here's the thing: the difference in fitness. And again, I'll kind of help give a definition here that I think makes more sense for people to grasp this. We can talk about your fitness in terms of things like VO2 max or resting heart rate or average HRV or some measure of peak power output. These are fitness metrics, right? And it takes a certain level of fitness to compete at the highest levels. Conditioning is how well you can use the fitness that you've got to complete or compete or do something very specific like we're talking about here. It's not a huge difference in fitness between doing what you talked about in the first case versus doing what you talked about in the second case. It's not like you have to have completely different physiology to go from 6 minutes to 20 minutes or 10 minutes or whatever. The physiology is basically the same, but it's how you structure the pace. It's how your brain understands a task. It's how you manage that energy that becomes the biggest differentiating factor here. So I'm saying you don't need like this massively different training in terms of, oh, I've got to develop fitness entirely different for one competition versus the other because one's these 6-minute rounds or one's a 10, 20-minute, whatever. The fitness is the same. It's just the pacing that has to be the differentiating factor. You have to learn that pacing. So if I'm leading up to a particular event, then again, I shift my pacing all towards that pace. If I also need to start building some awareness of longer paces in there in the process, I'm just going to add that in at some point. Maybe one day a week, I start simulating the second pace that I'm going to need for a championship match or championship level or whatever the case may be. I'm going to start adding that in. The closer I get to it, maybe the more I do of it. It doesn't have to be all or nothing. You don't have to do only this or only that. You can just start mixing those things in, and your training, your body will start to learn and adapt. You'll start to be recognize the difference between, a 20-minute round versus a 6-minute round, or it'll start to recognize the difference between the first 3 minutes of this versus the second 3 minutes of this. Just the more specific elements you incorporate, the more the body starts to learn and recognize what is the right pacing. It's a problem of the brain optimizing for the conditions that you're in. And if you have never experienced the conditions, the brain doesn't have a clue how to optimize. It doesn't know. It'd be like I told you, run as fast as you can. And you would say, well, for how long? And I'd say, just run as fast as you can. Well, what the hell does that mean? Like you have to have context. And the brain is learning context by doing the specific events. And so you just start incorporating those specific trainings in there. The closer you get to one competition, the more you do of that specific thing, and you can just make adjustments. But again, you have to have the fitness. If you don't have the fitness, then your pace is going to be lower because you just can't generate the energy. But once you've got the fitness level down, which you have to win, obviously, then it's literally just the body learning the context it has to perform in.
It's very refreshing talking to you. I appreciate this. It's things, they sound simple, but they sound simple because you have so much experience and real life experience actually putting these kind of things into play. but it's nice to hear that the answer isn't some super dogmatic, crazy thing that's catchy, but it's this, like, I think people can actually take this kind of stuff and they can apply it to their training, because that makes sense to me. Why, if you're going to go to a jiu-jitsu tournament and all you've done ever is train from sitting down cross-legged and slapping hands, and then you get to the tournament and they start you standing up, that's going to throw your, if you had never experienced that, that alone will override
Yep.
your system, dump a bunch of adrenaline, gas you out. And now it doesn't matter how many rounds at 5 minutes you train from your butt, because you never did something specific to the sport that you're actually going to go do.
Yeah, it'll
So
throw you
keeping that in
completely
mind
off.
is a very applicable.
Real quick. The easiest way to do this is reverse
Yeah.
engineer the competition back in your training. So once you've had some competitive experience, remember what that feels like, and then start incorporating elements of what that felt like into your training. It really is that simple.
So we'll jump into a couple of audience questions here that were submitted. I posed to Reddit that you would be coming on, and people are pretty excited about it. So jiu-jitsu specific questions for a lot of this kind of stuff,
Sure.
and contest prep. But I picked out a few of them that I felt were like pertinent, and I know they're going to be psyched to hear your answers on them. So starting from the top, this comes from a black belt, and he said, one thing I struggle with is taking my foot off the gas pedal before competition. Does Joel have any tips on winding down and being well rested for important competitions?
Yeah, look, that's a really important question. And obviously, I've taken a lot of athletes through fight camps, up through fight nights. The biggest thing I'll say is that it's normal and natural to feel like if you take your foot off the gas too much, that you're going to maybe become more deconditioned or you're not going to be ready to fight. And the truth is, you need to keep up the intensity. You just need to cut back the volume. So all the way through fight week, even to some extent during the fight, preparation the day of fight, like we're doing some high intensity work. You can still roll, you can still do the things that get your heart rate up and prepare you. You just have to do it in much smaller amounts. So I would say you just want to shift your mindset a little bit away from thinking, you can't do any hard work or you're going to be conditioned, so you have to do too much, to just thinking it's just about dialing the volume back. Instead of doing an hour, do 20 minutes, 30 minutes, and just start to gradually reduce that the last, I would say, 10 days or so. And you'll keep that level of intensity in there so you can feel good about it, but you'll also give yourself a chance to recover by just cutting back how much you're doing.
And that's an important point, because that gives them the mental piece, right? The part of, I'm still working hard, I'm still able to do this without costing their body something that they can't get back before a tournament.
Yeah, exactly. You don't want to stop doing what your body's used to doing. It's used to doing it. And as long as you've done a good job of managing the process, you don't go in the fight week completely trash to start with. I mean, you still need that intensity in there, and your body needs that stimulus, because if you do cut it all the way out, you're going to go probably the wrong direction. It's really just a question of how much, and that's where just dialing it back a bit makes a huge difference.
So we go to the next question. He says, this might be a blast from the past for you, but he says, talk about his time mentoring under Mel Siff. What are the biggest takeaways from the sessions that are still applicable today?
Yeah, that Mel Siff, that is a blast from the past. So, I don't know if I'd call myself mentoring under him. I went out to his house 2 or 3 times and spent some days there just learning, going through workshops with myself, just by myself a couple of times, and then with other groups of people. The biggest takeaway from Mel was just the insatiable desire to keep learning and keep improving, and also just an appreciation for the nuances and the complexities of this. I think when I first read Mel's book, Super Training, it was like drinking from a fire hose, because there was so much detailed information that made you appreciate that this really is a science behind it. It's not just throwing shit together and hoping that it works. There's real science behind improving your body's performance capabilities. And the higher levels you go, the more important understanding that science becomes, and the more costly just pure guesswork will become if you get the answers wrong. So, I really appreciated Mel's scientific mind approach to things, and this really kind of an engineering background also was very much on display when you would talk to him. So I just think, again, you have to understand that there's a lot of nuance, there's a lot of individuality, there's a lot of complexity, there's a lot of things we still don't understand, and so you just have to always keep trying to keep learning about the field in general and about your own physiology, your body's own individual differences and how you react to stuff, and then have a very dedicated mindset to constant improvement in both knowledge, application, and fitness, and the whole picture. If you want to keep improving up the ladder, that's the most important thing I got from Mel.
I love that. The desire to keep learning is something I really admire in people that have dedicated themselves to a craft for a long period of time, because you have to have that hunger to keep going in it. And few people have the stomach for that, to really stick around for a long period of time and stay interested. So I love that. This is a two-part question. So these people built on each other's, but he said, for someone who can only do conditioning sessions 1 to 3 times a week, and we touched on this a little bit earlier in the episode, besides grappling sessions, what would you prioritize and recommend? So I think they're looking to like types of exercises. And then to tag onto that, this person said, I'm also very curious about this. To add on, I suspect the recommendation would be zone 2 cardio. What would be the minimum effective dose if I am already grappling 3 to 4 times a week?
So, again, I know people want like what should I do? But it really kind of depends on where you're at and what you need. So sure, if somebody's, an easy thing is if someone's not progressing and they feel like they're not improving their conditioning, then obviously they need to improve something outside of their training. That could be including more lower intensity zone 2 work, like they asked, if that's what they need. Or maybe they need more high intensity work because they're not getting enough for whatever reason. They're doing lots of low. Not every BJJ guy is doing a bunch of high intensity. Some just are really slow and methodical and grinding. They don't get their heart rate up as much as they probably should. So it's kind of hard to say this is what you should do. It really depends on, again, what is your own limiting factor. And maybe it could be strength. Maybe their conditioning is just fine, but the strength's the problem. So that's where, again, evaluation and honest, pure assessment, evaluation of what are you really good at, what are you challenged by, and what do people exploit, right? What holes in your game are the good people able to get one over on you? And then in that limited time I have outside the training, I'm going to do whatever I need to improve that. So, if I'm just my lack of mobility in my hips, or I lack the ability to finish from certain positions, or maybe my core isn't strong enough, or maybe I do gas out, or maybe I'm not explosive enough, you really have to kind of find that for yourself and put all your effort into fixing that. I know that's not the go do this answer that people want, but it's really the only way to improve is to have a very good evaluation system in place, figure out what is wrong, and then attack that rather than just thinking, oh, I've got 2 sessions, I should just go do something. It's not about doing something. It's about doing what it is that you individually need to improve. And you've got to figure that out for yourself.
I'm laughing because I'm going back in time how many times I fielded questions about nutrition that are very similar to this. They're like, what should I eat? And the answer to that is not one size fits all. It is so dependent on other factors. It's dependent on your intake. It's dependent on your output. It's dependent on your sleep quality. What do you do for activities? Do you travel a lot? Do you have trouble eating at restaurants? Like, there's so many different things that go into it. And it goes back to what we talked about earlier with, knowledge. The more that you know about this, the simpler the answer is. It comes down to an individual approach. And I think it can be frustrating as the athlete sometimes because you want the answer to be so black and white, because that's why it's complicated to figure out in the first place. But the reality is you have to be interested in understanding where you are at, and things like Morpheus, or if you're wearing some sort of wearable, that begins to give you some of those pieces where you can piece together, how is my body recovering? Is today a day to go 9 out of 10, or is today a day to go 5 out of 10 consciously, so that I can allow myself to recover but still learn and then get back out there? This is actually interesting because this is specific to Morpheus. So this is another black belt. He said, this may be out of scope, but I'm curious how Joel's recommendations to time spent in target heart rate zones for combat athletes differ from Morpheus's target heart rate zones. In the same realm, does the stress recovery curve change?
Yeah, that's a good question. So when we built the Morpheus target heart rate zones, for people who aren't Morpheus users or aware, what we did and what I tried to do is answer the question of how much volume at different levels of intensity do people need over periods of time to improve their conditioning. Now, first of all, how do we define conditioning? Well, really we define it by an increase in average HRV and a decrease in average resting heart rate. So it's really more of a fitness metric, right? We're actually talking about improvements in aerobic fitness above all else, because that translates across so many different areas. And so what we did is we took people, we categorized them using those metrics into high fitness, low fitness, and medium fitness. So just across the spectrum, low, medium, high. And then we basically tracked what people did over 12-week periods of time, because 12 weeks is a reasonable enough time that, you see improvements that are measurable and important and everything else. And then we basically tried to figure out, okay, what did people do? How much time did people spend in each of the three zones that saw improvements in those numbers versus people who either saw no improvements or people who saw decreases in those metrics? And so those are the starting points of what Morpheus is then using as your weekly recommendations. Now, it also then changes over time based on how you're recovering, based on whether or not you're hitting those metrics or going over them, based on your recovery and all these different things. So it's trying to adjust these over time. So it's important to understand, again, we just are able to look at averages and then take you and see where you fit in the starting point, and then show you what worked on average for other people that were similar to you when they began over 12-week periods. Again, the problem here is we can't tell you exactly what you individually need. We're just estimating what other people that looked similar to you in terms of their fitness metrics did that saw improvements. It doesn't mean that if you go over that or under that, you're not going to improve. This is just what we saw. But again, it comes down to that individual nature. So I wouldn't say that, because you train combat sports, you are inherently different than someone who trains endurance sports. If you want to improve your aerobic fitness, this is just the pattern that we saw in people who improve their aerobic fitness over 12-week periods of time. So if that's your goal, then the Morpheus target zones are a really good starting point for you. And it's going to adapt those numbers over time, like I said, based on what it sees as you're progressing. It doesn't mean, again, that if you are outside of those, you're not going to improve, or that you are going to get worse. It just means this is what we saw in people that got better. But again, this is where individuality plays a huge role. There were certainly some people that might have been different than that, and we can only talk about on average. So anytime you're talking about these metrics, I think it's just important. These are guidelines. These are help you go the right direction. These are things to help give you that starting base to work from. They're not set in stone that you have to hit minute by minute, week by week, or you're going to fail. These are always just guidelines and recommendations. So you still want to look at all the individual metrics in Morpheus, and you still want to keep in mind your own goals, your own physiology, all those sorts of things. So it's a great tool because we are able to use machine learning and data in a powerful way that gives people these guidelines. But again, everything still comes down to you as an individual doing what you need to do.
And so is this, if they go, okay, you know what, I want to do this. I want to start to use Morpheus. I want to make decisions about my training from this. This is going to be best used if you're frequent with it, right? So it's going to actually learn about you the more you use it, right?
Yeah, absolutely. You want to be able to measure HRV as frequently as possible. Generally speaking, you want to get that done in the morning before you've done anything strenuous or done anything that would influence your HRV. And the more consistent you are with your measurement, the more that is going to reflect your body's stress and recovery cycle, the way your body is adapting to that. And then if you can get training data in there by wearing the Morpheus chest strap as much as you can, that makes it even more accurate. And then it'll also track activity and sleep, either from other wearables, or you just manually enter in your sleep and it'll track your phone's activity. The more data you feed it, the more it's an accurate reflection, because really what we want to know is what is your body going through, and then what is the response. That's what we want to fundamentally understand. Right. So the more information we're capturing on what your body's going through, the training, the sleep, all those sorts of things, and then we can get the response, which is the HRV and recovery. That helps us fill in those gaps and understand the whole story, so we can help provide the most accurate feedback and recommendations possible.
Looking back, we'll do one more here. So this person, I think I know how you're going to answer this based on our conversation, but he says, any plans for a more modern take on a broader summary as a follow-up book to the original, the one I mentioned earlier? I enjoyed the book, but the title seems to have pigeonholed the book's spread, in my experience, based on my time in other fitness and grappling circles like strongman, powerlifting, and wrestling, and even in MMA circles where the book and the methods seem unknown based on the time in real life. So I think it's a long-winded way of saying, is there an updated version of this more general to grappling sports as a whole? And although I think I know where you're going to go with this, I'm still curious to hear your answer.
Yeah, I would actually kind of argue the opposite in my experience, but obviously I'm biased because I get feedback from people. I have people in like right. whitewater rafting that are reading the book. I have people that are in UK rugby and those teams reading the book. I have people in Cirque du Soleil who've been reading the book. I mean, I've had people from more sports that I can possibly think of that I would never have imagined using methods from the book and reading through it for the different strategies, applying it. So I'm very still surprised at how many different people across so many different disciplines have found it somehow and have read it and applied it. So I don't know that it's, certainly it's not known everywhere. It's it's a book on MMA conditioning,
Right.
but I think it's been far more widely read and applied than I would have ever guessed to start with. So that's been awesome to see.
Well,
But secondly,
I'm
I've talked about doing a 2.0, but I can't tell you when.
I'm a use case for what you just said, because I had always been a fan of mixed martial arts since high school, but I purchased this book when I became a trainer professionally because I wanted to expand my knowledge of conditioning for general population clients. Then later, much later, I got into jujitsu. So it was actually a book that I found early, and it stayed in the closet, and I've kept referencing it throughout. And then when I got into grappling, then I really started to turn back to it because there's so many applicable things. But I think to so many points that you've made already in this, away from the dogmatism of things, these principles can be applied, and they're going to be, if you're a general person and you do something like water rafting, right? And your adrenaline spikes because the raft's coming up and you paddle really hard, and you go into an anaerobic zone just to get through the raft because it's exciting. There's things in here that are going to benefit you there. So there are, maybe it's not going to, you don't read the book and then go like PR your marathon time or something, but there are applicable principles that do show up, especially if you're interested in wrestling, grappling, striking, or anything that's even adjacent to that. So I love it, obviously. As I'm here excited to have you on. So
Yeah, it's funny because I still see all the time now. I'll be thumbing through a fitness article somewhere, or I'll be reading some article online somewhere, and then some method I named like HICT or HRI or cardiac output or explosive repeats. I mean, these are names that I just created to try to describe what I was doing. It's not like they were some standard definition of these things. I had to come up with a way to explain them to people, and you have to have a name. So I came up with various names like HICT, high intensity continuous training. I don't know that I definitely didn't invent the method, but I came up with the terminology to describe
right.
it. And I still see that mentioned all over the place. Most time that doesn't reference the book and all, which is fine. But I think it's spread actually quite a bit further than I would have, again, expected it to, just based on how many times I see people using methodology and referencing the name that I created, or people doing some technique that I know that they didn't get from somewhere else. It came from somewhere in the book. So, it's had a much wider reach than I, again, would have anticipated. It's been amazing to see that happen.
Well, I think it's you're a humble person, but I think it's a testament to your expertise. Even, and I try to point people here as much as I possibly can. Like, even the way that you represent yourself on social media is, it's very straightforward. It makes sense. There are principles that people can digest and understand and apply to their life. There's no bells, there's no whistles, and there's no bullshit. And in a space, the fitness space, where it's rife with that kind of stuff, it's kind of refreshing to come across someone who, like yourself, knows as much as you do, but is comfortable delivering it in a way where people can actually digest it and understand it. So I'm not surprised at all that, 11 years later, no, more than that, 20 years later now at this point, that this book is, when did this come out? This was 2009
Oh,
or
2009,
2000,
15 years later.
right? Yeah. So my
2009,
math is horrible at this time of day. So yeah. So 15
15
years later,
years.
um, it's been it's an awesome book, and I think people should not only get that, but they can look to everything you do at 8 weeks out. Also, great place to go for conditioning if you're getting ready for a tournament of any kind in the grappling world. The stuff that you're doing with Morpheus, where people can actually put themselves into action and start to learn about how their body operates and how it recovers. So it's been an absolute pleasure to sit down with you, Joel, and pick your brain. I'm very grateful that you took the time to be on here. We'll have to do it again in the future, hopefully one day in person, where we don't have to deal with Wi-Fi and all that kind of stuff. So thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, no problem. I appreciate you having me on, and I hope your audience finds this valuable. My goal is always to help people and just take what I've learned over the years and help people, learn from what I've learned and made mistakes from, so they don't have to do it themselves. So if I can do that, then I've done my job. And again, I'm sure I'll come back online one of these times, or like I said, maybe we can do it in person. We're happy to do either one.
Absolutely. Hey friends, Abe here. Thank you so much for tuning into this episode and sticking around to the very end. If you want to support it, leave a 5-star review on Spotify or check out www.maynideapodcast.com. Join the mailing list and stay up to date on all things The Mayn Idea, from future guests, sponsorship opportunities, products that I'm using to help me perform at my best, invites to ask me anything, and any upcoming pertinent information to the show. I cannot do this show without you. It is literally why I show up each week and put these episodes together. So thank you from the bottom of my heart from being part of the community. I hope you have a great day.